A quiet morning in a wealthy Florida neighborhood was shattered by a single scream. A successful businessman was found dead in his bathroom, shot 9 times. Inside the house were just 2 people, his ex-wife and their adult son. Each claimed innocence. Each pointed the finger at the other. But something doesn't add up. Who's lying? Who's hiding a secret? And is it possible that someone else slipped away before anyone arrived? As investigators dig deeper, they uncover a web of obsession, betrayal, and family secrets no one saw coming. What really happened inside that mansion? The truth may be more chilling than the crime itself. It was just past 7 a.m. when the calm, manicured stillness of Lake Haven Estates was pierced by the sharp chirp of a home alarm. This wasn't your average suburban neighborhood. Lake Haven was an enclave of gated luxury on the outskirts of Naples, Florida, where manicured hedges line the roads, and million-dollar yachts sit motionless in private docks. Security was tight, residents were discreet, and crime was a rarity. But on this quiet fall morning, that illusion of safety shattered in under 3 minutes. Luis Morales, a veteran security guard for the community, was on his routine patrol when the alert came in. A glass break sensor had been tripped at one of the larger estates, a sprawling 2-story villa owned by Harold Henderson, a well-known businessman in the area. Morales didn't hesitate. He drove to the address, his mind flickering between possible scenarios. Burglary? Malfunction? Maybe someone just dropped a glass. When Morales arrived at the estate, the front gate was ajar. The home loomed silently behind it, the morning sun casting long shadows across the white stone. He rang the bell once, then again, and then the front door opened. Standing there was 38-year-old Brent Henderson, Harold's only son. Disheveled, dazed, and dressed in day clothes that didn't match the early hour, Brent looked as if he'd been shaken awake in the middle of a dream. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. Morales remembered thinking he looked more confused than alarmed. Behind him, a woman's voice echoed down the hallway, shrill and panicked. "I think he's dead," she screamed. Morales asked Brent what was going on. The younger man muttered something about not knowing, that his mom had been screaming, and that his father was in the house. He seemed detached, as if reality hadn't quite caught up to him yet. Morales moved quickly inside. Patricia Henderson, the ex-wife of the homeowner, was stumbling out of the master suite, sobbing uncontrollably. Her hands trembled as she pointed back toward the bedroom, unable to form coherent words. When Morales stepped into the master bathroom, time seemed to freeze. Blood coated the white tile floor. Shattered safety glass glinted like ice under the soft vanity lights. And there, collapsed near the shower, was the motionless body of Harold Henderson. His hand was still clutching a pistol. His eyes were open but lifeless. The room smelled of gunpowder and something metallic. Morales instinctively secured the firearm, sliding it out of Harold's loose grip. Then he knelt beside the body and tried to render aid, but it was obvious there was nothing to be done. Harold was gone. Emergency services were called immediately. By the time local police and EMTs arrived, both Patricia and Brent were waiting outside. Patricia was inconsolable, crying, muttering fragments of prayers, rocking back and forth. Brent, on the other hand, sat stiffly on the front step. His face was blank. He wasn't crying. He wasn't angry. He just stared. Morales later told police that neither of them had visible injuries. No cuts. No bruises. No blood. Nothing on their clothing that would immediately scream guilt. Still, the situation felt off. The timing. The alarm. The presence of both mother and son inside the house. And that look in Brent's eyes, it wasn't just shock. It was something more complicated. Something unreadable. At first, investigators treated the scene as a possible suicide. After all, the victim had a gun in his hand. There were no signs of forced entry. And this was a man who had reportedly been under significant financial and emotional stress in recent months. The initial logic was simple. Perhaps Harold had taken his own life. But logic doesn't always tell the truth. As detectives canvassed the property, they quickly realized something didn't add up. There wasn't just one gun. Another firearm was found holstered on a bedroom dresser. Ballistics would later show that both weapons had been fired, and both had hit their target. Then came the real surprise. Harold hadn't been shot once or twice. He'd been shot 9 times. The suicide theory collapsed instantly. Patricia refused to speak to officers at the scene. She was too distraught, they said, unable to respond to questions. She didn't deny anything. She didn't confirm anything. She just wept. Brent, on the other hand, offered up his version of events almost immediately. He said he'd been asleep in his room when the alarm woke him. Or maybe it was the sound of gunfire. He wasn't sure. From his doorway, he said, he could see his mother pacing and screaming. His father was on the bathroom floor, and there was blood. He claimed he was too afraid to come out. That he hid. That he stayed in his room until Morales arrived. But something didn't sit right with the responding officers. If Brent was so frightened, why wasn't he showing it? If Patricia had witnessed the gruesome death of the man she had once loved, why didn't she say a word? And if Harold had been shot 9 times, how had neither of them been covered in blood? In a case like this, details matter. Every second counts. And every word, or lack thereof, can change everything. The morning alarm at Lake Haven Estates was more than a security alert. It was the opening note in a violent family opera, and only 2 people had front-row seats. One was crying, the other wasn't, and somewhere between them was the truth. What started as a suspected suicide quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. When detectives stepped into the Henderson residence that morning, they were immediately struck by its order. The living room was pristine. No overturned furniture. No signs of struggle. It was the kind of home you'd see in a real estate catalog, staged and spotless. But that perfect image was broken the moment they crossed the threshold into the master suite. In the bathroom, where Harold Henderson had been found, the chaos told a different story. Blood had pooled around the shower, soaking into the grout. Shards of tempered glass were everywhere, on the floor, in the sink, embedded in the bath mat. The mirror was fogged from the steam that lingered, now tinged with traces of red. The first gun had already been collected. Luis Morales had removed it from Harold's hand, placing it gently on the bathroom counter when EMTs arrived. But it wasn't the only weapon in the room. Lying in plain view on the bedroom dresser was a second handgun, still holstered. And that was just the beginning. As crime scene technicians combed through the house, they uncovered a small arsenal, 24 additional firearms stashed in various locations throughout the property. Closets, drawers, under beds, in locked cabinets, rifles, handguns, boxes upon boxes of ammunition. It was clear that both Harold and Brent had more than just a passing interest in firearms. They were collectors, maybe even fanatics. But the presence of so many guns only raised more questions. Why would a man with access to that kind of firepower shoot himself 9 times? And with 2 different weapons? The preliminary autopsy confirmed it. Harold had been shot in multiple places: chest, shoulder, abdomen, and finally, once through the mouth. At least 2 of the wounds were fatal on their own. The fatal shot to the face had been delivered last. This wasn't a suicide. This was an execution. The ballistics team worked quickly to match bullet fragments found inside the body to the weapons recovered. Both the gun from Harold's hand and the one on the dresser had been fired. In fact, both had been used to shoot him. Alternating shots, different calibers, different trajectories. It was brutal, excessive, and intentional. What was even more disturbing was the absence of forced entry. Every door was locked. The windows intact. The alarm system, which had triggered the security call, had gone off only after the glass shower door shattered from gunfire. The system wasn't tripped by someone entering. It was tripped by the act of murder itself. That left detectives with only 2 possible suspects, Patricia and Brent. They were the only ones in the house. And they each had motive. Patricia had just recently moved back into the home after years of separation and divorce. By all accounts, she'd believed the reconciliation was real. But Harold had been making plans for a trip with another woman, his longtime business partner and rumored lover, Francine Tyler. Patricia had lent Harold a significant amount of money to help save the home from foreclosure. Detectives would later learn she had started keeping a diary, chronicling her doubts, her hurt, and her growing resentment. Brent's motives were more complicated. He had a history with illegal firearms. Years earlier, he'd been arrested for selling a gun to an undercover federal agent, something he insisted his father pressured him into doing. That arrest cost him his firearms license, his business, and 5 months in federal prison. Since then, he'd been unemployed and living under the same roof as the man he blamed for ruining his life. Inside one of Brent's suitcases, officers found ammunition that matched the bullets used in the murder. When questioned about it, Brent seemed unsurprised. He claimed he didn't know which ammo was his, and which was his father's. "We had so many," he reportedly said. "It was all mixed up." Forensic specialists collected DNA swabs from both Patricia and Brent. The results only deepened the mystery. The gun recovered from Harold's hand had traces of 2 DNA profiles, one belonging to Harold, the other inconclusive. Brent and Luis Morales were ruled out, but Patricia couldn't be eliminated. The gun on the dresser, also used in the shooting, carried a different mixture of DNA. Again, 2 profiles. Again, inconclusive. Then there was the blood smear. On the interior side of the front gate, far from the bedroom, far from the scene of the crime, investigators discovered a faint smear of blood, just a few inches long, almost invisible to the naked eye. But lab analysis revealed something curious. 2 separate DNA profiles were present. One belonged to Harold. The other belonged to an unidentified individual. That smear would become the centerpiece of a swirling theory. Was there a third person in the house that morning? Was the killer neither Patricia nor Brent, but a mystery intruder who managed to enter unnoticed and vanish without a trace? Or was the smear simply a transfer, left behind by gloves, supplies, or even first responders? At this point in the investigation, there were no definitive answers, only fragments of a puzzle that refused to come together. Patricia still hadn't spoken. Brent continued to claim he slept through most of the event, heard some pops, saw his mom pacing, and stayed in his room out of fear. The public didn't know what to believe, and neither did police. But one thing was crystal clear. This was no longer the case of a man who took his own life. This was the deliberate, up-close killing of a man in his own home, with no signs of forced entry. And 2 people, both grieving, both suspicious, each swearing they didn't pull the trigger. Someone was lying. And the only question now was who? Behind the carefully curated furniture, the gleaming floors, and the gated walls of the Henderson estate was a history thick with resentment, betrayal, and quiet collapse. Detectives knew that to understand the murder, they had to understand the people inside that house, Harold, Patricia, and Brent, not just who they were that morning, but who they had been in the months and years leading up to it. Because behind every family tragedy is the kindling that fuels it. Harold Henderson wasn't always cold and distant. Decades earlier, he'd been the kind of man who built dreams from the ground up. Trained as a real estate attorney, Harold had pivoted into hotel development in the early 80s and made a small fortune before turning 40. That fortune allowed him to retire early, buy a mansion in Lake Haven Estates, and live the kind of lifestyle most people only imagine. 2 homes, classic cars, international vacations, and more guns than some police departments. But success has a way of eroding people, especially when it mixes with pride. Harold's family saw less of his generosity and more of his control. He married Patricia when they were still young, 2 high school sweethearts who once swore they'd grow old together. They had their only child, Brent, 6 years later. For a while, things seemed stable. But over time, control turned into criticism and affection turned into distance. In 2001, after more than 30 years of marriage, Patricia and Harold divorced. The split, though legal, was anything but clean. She moved out. He moved on. Or at least pretended to. But that wasn't the end. Just 4 months after their divorce was finalized, Harold invited Patricia back into his life and remarried her. It didn't last. The second marriage crumbled even faster than the first, this time with more bitterness, more silence, and deeper scars. And yet, Patricia always hovered on the periphery of Harold's life, a figure not fully present but never quite gone. By 2011, things had shifted again. Harold's finances weren't what they used to be. He'd sunk a considerable amount of money into an overseas resort project, one that promised big returns but required short-term capital. He was burning through cash and fast. That's when Patricia came back into the picture. She still loved him, or maybe she loved the idea of what they used to be. Either way, she agreed to move back in, but not without cost. Harold asked her for a $200,000 loan, money she had saved from her own investments and family inheritance. In return, he promised reconciliation, a renewed life together, a second chance at forever. She said yes. She moved back into the Lake Haven estate. But the romance never really rekindled. Not the way she'd hoped. Almost immediately, Patricia began keeping a journal, a kind of emotional survival log. In March, she wrote, "Harold asked about $200,000 to keep both houses afloat and move back in and reconcile. Great day. Harold loves me and I love him. I want to help." But just 4 months later, the tone had changed. Her July entries hinted at suspicion. By August, she wrote of lies, cold behavior, and what she described as mental games. By early September, she referred to Harold not by name, but as Mr. Meanie. He'd promised a future, but his attention was elsewhere, on his business partner Francine Tyler. Francine lived just 10 houses down the street. She and Harold spent time together daily. They texted, they traveled, they held hands in public. They even kissed openly at social gatherings. To Patricia, it wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. Then there was Brent. After his prison stint for the illegal gun sale, Brent found it nearly impossible to land a steady job. Employers didn't look kindly on felony records, especially those involving firearms. So he did the only thing he felt he could. He moved back home. Back under the roof of the man who, in his words, had set him up to fail. Detectives learned that Brent blamed Harold for everything. The arrest, the conviction, the probation, the 5 months in prison. He said it all started when Harold encouraged him to buy a conversion kit online, one that could turn a semi-automatic handgun into a fully automatic weapon. Illegal, dangerous, tempting. Brent followed through, was caught, and the rest is history. What haunted Brent more than the jail time was the memory of Harold laughing when the feds showed up. That laughter, he claimed, echoed louder than the courtroom verdict. After prison, Brent's life unraveled. He'd lost custody of his daughter. His business was shut down. He had no source of income. When Patricia moved back in, she begged Harold to let Brent stay too. Harold reluctantly agreed, but the household turned tense. One friend of the family later said that being in that house felt like standing in a thunderstorm with no rain, just waiting for lightning to strike. And lightning did strike. Patricia was growing increasingly unstable. Neighbors noticed her weight loss, her hollow gaze, her sudden outbursts. Friends said she was trying hard, cooking meals, cleaning, attending church, but behind closed doors, she was unraveling. Brent, meanwhile, spent his days mostly in the garage, tinkering with old electronics and reloading ammo. He avoided Harold when he could, and when they spoke, it often ended in shouting matches. Tensions reached a boiling point the night before the murder. Harold had taken Brent and his daughter out for burgers. Over dinner, Harold made 2 bold claims. First, that he still loved Patricia in some small way, that she was, after all, the mother of his son. But then, in the same breath, he said he was leaving the next morning for a trip to North Carolina, with Francine. His bags were already packed. When Brent got home that night, he said nothing to Patricia. But maybe he didn't have to, because the next morning, Harold Henderson was dead. And the people who lived with him had more than memories. They had motives. While detectives worked to untangle the toxic web inside the Henderson home, there was one thread that kept pulling tighter, leading them away from the house and 10 doors down the street. Her name was Francine Tyler. Business partner, best friend, confidant, or, depending on who you asked, Harold's secret lover. Francine was elegant, polished, always smiling. She was the kind of woman who hosted wine tastings on Thursday nights and knew everyone's dog by name. But beneath that charm was a woman deeply entangled in the life and death of Harold Henderson. When detectives arrived at her front door, she already knew. "He's gone, isn't he?" she whispered. They hadn't told her yet. Francine invited them inside, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee for the officers. She was visibly shaken but composed. When asked about her relationship with Harold, she didn't hesitate. "We were business partners. And yes, we were very, very close. But it was never physical. Not in the way people think." She described Harold as brilliant, funny, generous, and yes, deeply complicated. He could be so loving and so cold, 5 minutes apart. He had secrets. And he never wanted anyone, especially Patricia, to know them all. Francine denied any romantic relationship, but admitted the emotional connection was undeniable. They traveled together, held hands in public. He sent her flowers on her birthday. They spent most evenings texting back and forth, often until midnight. Detectives pressed further. "Were you in love with him?" Francine paused. "I don't know if that word even fits, but I would have followed him anywhere." She then told them something that gave even the most seasoned detectives pause. 2 weeks before his death, Harold had pulled her aside during a business dinner. His tone was quiet, almost conspiratorial. "If anything ever happens to me," he said, "promise me you'll fight. Fight to make sure I get justice." At the time, she brushed it off. Harold was prone to dramatics, especially when he drank. But now those words chilled her to the bone. Francine believed Harold sensed something, that he knew bringing Patricia back into the house wasn't just a bad idea, it was dangerous. She told detectives about the deal he'd made. That Patricia could move back in and play the role of supportive partner, but only after lending him $200,000. He needed the cash. The house was in trouble. So was the business. But what Patricia didn't know, or maybe didn't want to admit, was that Harold never stopped seeing Francine. The very night Patricia moved back in, Harold had dinner with Francine. And the next morning, she found a bouquet of lilies on her front porch, with a note that simply read, "Still us." When detectives asked Francine whether Patricia was aware of their closeness, she laughed bitterly. "Oh, she knew. You think you can live 10 houses away and not feel that kind of thing?" According to Francine, Patricia had grown increasingly hostile. She once left a voice message on Francine's business line, just heavy breathing and a single sentence, "You'll regret this." She played it off at the time, but now, in hindsight, it felt like a threat. The conversation then shifted to Brent. What did Francine think of him? She hesitated. "I never liked him," she admitted. Harold loved his son, but also feared him. He'd say Brent was like holding a loaded gun. You didn't know when it would go off, but you knew it would. Francine recalled that Harold had once told her that Brent blamed him for everything. The arrest, the felony conviction, the failed business. He believed Harold had set him up, even laughed when he was dragged away in handcuffs. That bitterness never faded. And then came the turning point. Detectives showed Francine a photo of the packed suitcase, Harold's, found near the front door. He was preparing for a weekend trip to Asheville, North Carolina, and she was going with him. "He didn't tell Patricia," Francine whispered. "He couldn't. He told me he'd deal with it after the weekend. He said she was fragile, but I think he just didn't want the explosion. That suitcase may have been the spark that lit the fuse." Patricia had invested money, hope, maybe even love, only to watch the man she had forgiven prepare to leave her again. But this time, it wasn't just a trip. It was the end of the illusion. The reality she didn't want to face. That she had never really won Harold back. When asked if she believed Patricia was capable of murder, Francine didn't answer right away. She simply leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and said, "If she thought she was losing him for good? Yes. I think she could do anything." Detectives thanked Francine for her time, but they left with more than just a witness statement. They left with a picture of a woman scorned, of a son resentful, and of a man trying to balance two worlds, unaware that one of them would kill him. Was Francine just the other woman? Or was she the reason Harold ended up dead in a pool of his own blood? Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The love triangle inside Lake Haven Estates wasn't just complicated. It was combustible, and someone had finally lit the match. Brent Henderson wasn't just a suspect. He was also a witness, a grieving son, a man caught in the gravitational pull of two forces, his father's legacy and his mother's unraveling mind. At least, that's how he wanted to be seen. From the very beginning, Brent had been vocal, cooperative, willing. He gave statements to police without a lawyer present. He answered every question. He even volunteered to take a gunshot residue test, on the spot. His hands came back clean. It was a detail his defense would later lean on heavily. But to detectives, the clean test didn't erase the weight of his words, or the strange way he said them. In his official statement, Brent described waking up to a loud noise. He wasn't sure if it was gunfire or the home alarm. He'd been sleeping with earplugs in, standard practice, he said, ever since moving back in with his parents. He removed one earplug and sat up in bed, disoriented. That's when he heard it, screaming. His mother calling his name. "Brent! Brent!" He cracked open his door. What he saw, he claimed, was chaos. His mother was in the living room, pacing in frantic circles, arms waving, voice shrill. He couldn't see the bathroom clearly, but he could see a shape on the floor. And blood. A lot of blood. He froze. "I know that sounds awful," he said. "But I was terrified. I didn't know what I was walking into." He told police he stayed in his room until he heard the security guard's voice, and only then did he step out. Detectives asked him repeatedly, "Did you hear anything before the alarm?" "I heard popping noises," he said. "Maybe 2. Maybe 3. I didn't count." They asked, "Did you see a gun in your mother's hand?" He hesitated. "I don't remember," he replied. It all happened so fast. But there was something odd about Brent's version of fast. He recalled specific things, his mom's screams, the way she moved her arms, the tone of her voice. But other things? He drew blanks. He couldn't remember where his own clothes were, whether he had put on shorts before coming out, or if the bathroom door was open or closed. It wasn't amnesia. It was selective memory. The detectives noticed it too. As the interview went on, Brent seemed more comfortable, too comfortable. His words flowed like someone rehearsing lines, not recalling trauma. That changed when they brought up motive. They asked if he was still angry about the past, about being arrested, about losing his business. He shook his head. No, that's behind me. But when they pushed, reminding him that he'd once told friends Harold ruined his life, his tone hardened. I was upset back then. But you don't get it. My dad, he could destroy you without raising his voice. That's how he worked. Quiet manipulation. Like gravity, you couldn't see it, but you felt it every day. Then came the most chilling part of the conversation. Detectives asked Brent what his mother said to him after the shooting. He paused, looked down, then answered. She just kept saying, "He was so awful, over and over." They asked, did she say she killed him? No, never. But she wasn't herself. She hadn't been for a long time. Brent described his mother's decline in vivid detail. She used to be vibrant, charismatic, the kind of mom everyone wished they had, he said. But over the last few years, that woman had disappeared. She became withdrawn, paranoid. She'd walk from room to room talking to herself. She'd cry for no reason. She barely ate. Her hair thinned. Her voice trembled even when she wasn't upset. She was sick, Brent said. And I don't just mean sad. I mean something was broken in her. But did that brokenness explain what happened that morning? Or was it being used as a shield? Brent seemed to want both things, to paint his mother as a victim, and to distance himself from the crime. But he couldn't have it both ways. And detectives weren't buying it. So they dug deeper. They asked if he'd ever had violent arguments with Harold. He said no. But phone records told a different story. Heated calls, some ending in hang-ups, others in long silences. They asked why his suitcase was packed with ammunition that matched the bullets found in Harold's body. He said it was coincidence, that the house was full of ammo, that maybe his dad had used it too. But most troubling of all was a detail Brent offered voluntarily. He described hearing a clicking sound, like a gun being fired without bullets. Dry firing, he said. You know, when the chamber's empty. That metallic click. The detectives leaned in. That was an advanced term, one used by people trained in firearms. It wasn't the kind of thing most people would notice, especially during a moment of panic. Then came one final question. Brent, did you kill your father? He didn't blink. No, I didn't. And I'll take any test you want to prove it. And your mother? Brent looked away. His voice lowered. She's not capable of that. She raised me. She loved him. She was just lost. But love doesn't always stop bullets. And loss doesn't always excuse silence. By the end of the interview, the detectives had heard enough. 2 people were in that house. Both had motive. Only one was covered in grief. And the other? Well, he was just strangely calm. When police find blood, they look for DNA. When they find words, they look for motive. And in the case of Harold Henderson, they found both. In the days following the murder, investigators turned their attention to 2 things that could speak louder than any witness testimony: the physical evidence and Patricia's private thoughts. Let's start with the forensics. The 2 guns used in the murder had already been processed. Both had fired rounds that struck Harold. One had been found on the floor, the other on the dresser. Both carried traces of DNA. Neither conclusively pointed to a single shooter. But it was what they didn't find that made things more confusing. There were no fingerprints. No blood splatter on Patricia. No gunpowder residue on Brent. And then there was the smear. A single, partial streak of blood on the inside of the front gate, almost 30 feet from the crime scene. It wasn't much. A couple of inches at most. The kind of thing most people would miss entirely. But under luminol, it lit up like a flare. Lab analysis confirmed it contained 2 DNA profiles. One belonged to Harold. The other didn't match Brent. It didn't match Patricia. And it didn't match any first responders at the scene. A ghost print. To some investigators, it looked like a mistake, a transfer, a glove smear, a stray contaminant. But to others, it looked like a third person. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who got away. It gave defense attorneys ammunition of their own. But it didn't give them answers. And that's where Patricia's diary came in. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't encrypted. It sat on her bedside table, soft leather cover worn from years of use. Investigators flipped it open, not knowing whether they'd find something useful, or just the musings of a lonely woman. They found much more than that. The entries started in early 2011. At first, they were hopeful. Romantic. Childlike in their optimism. Harold said, he wants us to try again. He's been so kind lately. Smiling. Holding my hand. It's like the old days again. Then came the financial details. He asked for $200,000. Said it's just temporary. I agreed. I want us to be whole again. I want to help. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. By July, Patricia's tone had turned cold. Harold is gone all day. Says he's working. But I know where he is. I heard him whispering on the phone last night. He won't admit it, but I'm not stupid. By August, suspicion had turned to despair. My heart is broken. He's gaslighting me, making me think I'm crazy. I don't sleep. I barely eat. I feel like I'm disappearing. And then came September. Still lying. Still disappearing at night. Still texting her. I saw the messages. They weren't business. He calls her sweetheart. He's never called me that. Not once. On September 5th, just 25 days before the murder, Patricia wrote, "Another long day of lies. Mr. Meanie is back. That's what I'll call him now. The man I once loved is gone." It was the first time she stopped using Harold's name. To investigators, the diary became a roadmap of descent, from longing to resentment to fury. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. And yet, it wasn't enough. The diary didn't put a gun in Patricia's hand. It didn't explain why Brent's suitcase had ammo matching the murder weapons. And it didn't clarify who left that bloody trace on the gate. So investigators kept digging. They reviewed Harold's phone logs. Dozens of calls to Francine, often late at night. Some lasting minutes. Others hours. His last outgoing call had been to Francine, 10 minutes before the alarm was triggered. They pulled security footage from neighborhood gates. Nothing unusual. No signs of visitors. No vehicles entering or exiting near the time of death. They rechecked the alarm system logs. No motion sensors had been tripped in the hours before the gunshots. The house was sealed. So if there was a third person, how did they get in? No answers. And then came a new detail. One so subtle, it almost went unnoticed. When EMTs arrived, one of them offered Patricia a bottle of water. She shook her head and pointed to her ears. "I can't hear." They thought it was grief. Shock. Trauma. But later tests confirmed that Patricia had suffered a permanent 48% loss of hearing in both ears. Most likely from being near a firearm when it was discharged in a confined space. In other words, she had been in the bathroom when the shots were fired. That kind of hearing damage doesn't happen from down the hall. It happens when you're feet away. And that made her silence even more haunting. At the scene, she barely spoke. To police. To her son. To paramedics. When they pronounced Harold dead, she didn't cry out. She didn't ask questions. She just sat, still and broken. Some saw that as evidence of shock. Others saw it as the silence of guilt. The investigators were torn. The evidence pointed in all directions and none at once. Each new piece of information seemed to contradict the last. One gun had her DNA. Another had someone else's. The diary said she was unraveling. But her clean clothes said otherwise. Brent swore he never left his room. But his own words betrayed deeper knowledge. The blood on the gate whispered about a stranger. But the house told the story of two people who knew every creak in the floor. This wasn't a case of whodunit. It was a case of who's lying better. Because in this home of secrets, money, and memory, only one person pulled the trigger. But everyone had their finger on it. It took nearly 2 years for the case to go to trial. By then, the media had seized on every detail. Millionaire murder in a gated community, an ex-wife accused, a bitter son, a mysterious woman down the street, and blood where there shouldn't be blood. The prosecution didn't need to fabricate a story. The truth, whatever version people believed, was already stranger than fiction. Patricia Henderson stood trial in the summer of 2013, charged with first-degree murder and the use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. She was 66 years old, dressed conservatively, hair neatly styled, face unreadable. She looked more like a retired librarian than a cold-blooded killer. But the prosecution painted a different picture. In their opening statement, they called it a crime of obsession, jealousy, and entitlement. Patricia, they argued, had spent decades tethered to Harold, first by marriage, then by memory, then by money. When he tried to cut the cord one final time, she snapped. They laid it out like a timeline. Harold asks Patricia for $200,000. She agrees, thinking it's a reconciliation. She moves back in, but instead of rekindling love, she watches as Harold grows closer to Francine, more affectionate, more public, more confident. And then the final insult, she finds the packed suitcases by the front door. Not just a business trip, a weekend getaway, with the woman he actually cared for. The state's theory was brutal in its simplicity. You don't get to leave me. Not again. Not after everything I gave you. Not for her. Then came the bullets. 9 of them. 2 different guns. 1 dead man. The prosecution brought in ballistics experts, crime scene analysts, and even an audiologist who testified that Patricia's hearing loss was consistent with being mere feet away from the muzzle of a fired weapon. The expert made it clear, Patricia didn't just witness the shooting. She had been there, inside the blast radius. Then came the DNA analyst. She explained that Patricia's DNA couldn't be excluded from one of the murder weapons. That alone wasn't damning, but when paired with motive, location, and timing, it painted a chilling picture. And then came the diary. The prosecution read entry after entry aloud in court. From Harold loves me and I want to help, to Mr. Meanie is back, to I stayed home all day very tired. Each one showed a descent, hope curdling into hatred, love into fixation. One juror would later say, "It wasn't the gun. It was the words. That's where you saw the murder begin." But the defense had a story of their own. To them, Patricia wasn't a killer. She was a woman manipulated, discarded, and gaslit until she lost her grip on reality. If anything, they argued, she was a victim of Harold, of the justice system, and of a son whose motives were far more suspicious. They pointed to Brent. The ammo in his suitcase. The hatred in his voice. The felony conviction. The years of unemployment. The comments about being set up by Harold. They reminded the jury that Brent had once read a book titled Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors. A how-to guide on murder for hire. Prosecutors laughed it off as circumstantial. But to the defense, it was a blueprint. And then came their strongest argument, trajectory. Their expert witness, a forensic pathologist, took the stand and walked the jury through each of the 9 gunshot wounds. The entry points, the angles, the downward path of the bullets. She concluded that the shooter had to be taller than Patricia, by at least 6 inches. There was no way, she argued, that a woman of Patricia's height could have fired those shots from that angle. Unless, of course, she was standing on something. But that detail was never fully resolved. The defense then challenged the idea that Patricia could have committed the murder and walked away without a single speck of blood on her clothing. No visible spatter. No traces on her hands. Not even on the soles of her feet. They reminded the jury that Brent had claimed he handed his mother a napkin to wipe blood off her foot. But that napkin? Never found. Never tested. Never entered into evidence. Then came Brent himself. He took the stand and delivered what would become the most talked-about testimony of the trial. He spoke of waking to gunfire, of seeing his mother pace the living room, of hearing the sounds of a gun being dry-fired, clicked empty. He spoke about hearing his father gurgle as he lay dying, about asking his mother, "Did he attack you?" And about her response, "He was so awful. So awful." When asked directly if he killed his father, Brent said, "Absolutely not." And when asked if he hired anyone to do it for him, his answer was the same. But his calm demeanor unsettled some in the courtroom. One reporter described him as haunted but oddly rehearsed. The defense concluded with one final statement. If Patricia Henderson pulled the trigger, where's the proof? Not the motive. Not the diary. The proof. Where's the gunpowder? The blood? The bruises from recoil? The jury retired for deliberation. It didn't take long. Less than 2 hours later, they returned. Verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Patricia didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. To some, it was stoicism. To others, it was guilt. The judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing. She said nothing. And so, with a stroke of a pen, Patricia Henderson, once a wife, then an ex-wife, then a widow, became a convicted killer. But the story wasn't over. Because silence, like blood, has a way of resurfacing. Justice, the court had said, was served. But not everyone agreed. Just months after her conviction, Patricia Henderson's legal team filed an appeal. The grounds weren't dramatic, but they were powerful. Her silence, from the moment first responders arrived at the scene, had been used against her. And that, they argued, was unconstitutional. According to the defense, Patricia hadn't refused to speak because she was hiding something. She hadn't been calculating or evasive. She simply couldn't hear. And they had the audiology report to prove it. Medical experts testified that Patricia had suffered permanent hearing loss, nearly 50% in both ears, most likely caused by her proximity to the gunfire. In a closed bathroom, 2 guns firing 9 times at point-blank range, the blast pressure alone could rupture eardrums. Patricia hadn't just lost Harold. She'd lost sound itself. And yet, prosecutors had used her silence, The fact that she didn't scream, didn't protest, didn't explain, as a sign of guilt. They said it proved she had something to hide. But if she couldn't hear the questions, how could she answer them? It was a compelling argument. And in 2017, the appellate court agreed. The conviction was overturned. Patricia would face a second trial. By then, she was 70 years old. Her face had changed. Her shoulders drooped a little lower. Her hair had thinned. But her expression remained unreadable, same quiet stare, same clenched lips. The state brought the same evidence to the new courtroom. The diary, the hearing loss, the DNA, the trajectory, the weapons, the motive. But this time, things didn't move as swiftly. Jurors listened closely. They debated. They paused at every contradiction, every unanswered question, every missing detail. And when the time came to deliberate, they didn't rush. 6 jurors wanted to convict. 6 wanted to acquit. Deadlocked. The judge instructed them to go home, rest, and return the next day with clear minds. It worked. After a second day of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Guilty, but not of first-degree murder. This time, Patricia was convicted of second-degree murder. The distinction was subtle but significant. First-degree murder requires proof of premeditation, planning, intent, cold calculation. Second-degree murder is different. It still involves intentional killing, but fueled by rage, emotional disturbance, or a sudden, overwhelming loss of control. In other words, a crime of passion. It was a legal acknowledgement that maybe Patricia hadn't spent weeks plotting to kill Harold. Maybe she hadn't woken up that morning with murder on her mind. But when she saw those bags by the door, when she realized he was leaving her, again, for good, something inside her broke. And in that moment, she pulled the trigger. 9 times. The prosecution pushed for the maximum sentence, 32 years in prison. She showed no remorse, the attorney said. She never accepted responsibility. She blamed everyone, her husband, her son, even her own hearing. The defense countered, she's 70. She's frail. She has no prior record. She loved him. And she lost everything. But the court sided with the state. Patricia was sentenced to 32 years. In Florida, that's virtually a life sentence for someone her age. As she was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, a reporter asked, "Do you still deny killing your husband?" Patricia paused. For the first time in 2 trials, 2 verdicts, and 2 deaths, she opened her mouth. But no words came out. Just a long exhale. And then silence. Across town, Brent watched the news coverage alone in a small rental apartment. By now, he'd distanced himself from everything. The house, the headlines, the history. In an interview months later, he said, "I don't know if I've forgiven her. I don't even know if I should. But she was my mother. And he was my father. And now they're both gone. That's the only thing I'm sure of." When asked if he believed justice had been done, he gave a complicated answer. 2 juries said she did it. I wasn't in that bathroom. I can't say they were wrong. But part of me still wonders if someone else was. The smear of blood on the gate, the one with unidentified DNA, was never explained. Prosecutors insisted it came from a first responder. Defense attorneys called it a fingerprint from a ghost. No other suspects were ever identified. No one else was charged. And so the case, like so many true crime stories, ended not with clarity, but with a verdict. And a prison sentence. And questions lingering, nagging, impossible to silence. Was Patricia Henderson a woman scorned who lost control? Or was she a pawn in a more elaborate, colder game? Did Brent play a deeper role than he ever admitted? Or did he simply inherit the wreckage left behind? One thing's certain. In Lake Haven Estates, silence echoes longer than screams. And justice sometimes only whispers. The gavel had fallen. The courtroom was empty. The cameras were gone. And what remained were just the echoes of gunfire, of grief, of words that should have been spoken but never were. Patricia Henderson began her 32-year sentence at the Florida Women's Reception Center in Ocala. She arrived in a beige jumpsuit, escorted quietly through intake. No shackles. No tears. Just silence. The same silence that had followed her since that morning in the master bathroom. Her cell was small. The view limited to a chain-link fence and a sliver of overcast sky. She was 70 years old. There were no visitors. No interviews. No handwritten letters. Not even from Brent. She spent most days reading. Occasionally gardening with other inmates. She rarely spoke about the case. Only once, during a group therapy session, did she mention Harold's name. She said, "He was beautiful when he was young. Before the money. Before the control. I used to love him like you love a sunrise." Then I watched him set. She never said whether she killed him. She never denied it, either. And in a way, that refusal, so consistent, so unwavering, became its own answer. Meanwhile, the Lake Haven Estates community tried to return to normal. The Henderson house was sold at auction. New owners painted the exterior a pale blue, hoping to change the energy. But neighbors still whispered every time they walked past. That's the house, they'd say. The one where the man in the shower never walked out again. And just 10 doors down, Francine Tyler kept the curtains closed. She never gave another public interview. Never commented on the second trial. She sold her home less than a year later and moved to Georgia, where she opened a small antiques shop with her sister. But those who knew her said she was never quite the same. One friend recalled, "It was like she got quieter, like she never laughed with her eyes again." She kept one photo of Harold, tucked behind the register, in a silver frame. In it, they were smiling at a vineyard in Sonoma. He had his arm around her. She had her hand on his heart. She never explained why she kept it. She didn't need to. And then there was Brent. After the second conviction, he disappeared. Not physically, he stayed in the States, but emotionally, spiritually. He severed ties with neighbors, declined all media requests, and started using his mother's maiden name when applying for jobs. In a rare interview granted to a local podcast, he spoke quietly, carefully. "People say I'm the only one who won. But I didn't win. I just survived." He moved to Portland, Oregon, working in IT support under a new identity. He never remarried. He didn't return to Florida. He didn't visit Patricia, not once. When asked why, he paused. Then said, "Because if she did it, I don't want to see her. And if she didn't, I don't want her to see me." The host asked if he believed in justice. Brent laughed bitterly. "Justice is a word. Closure's a myth. The only thing that's real is absence. And that house is full of it." Over the years, more details surfaced. A retired detective came forward in a documentary, claiming there were things left unexplored. DNA samples never retested. A set of prints on a window latch that didn't match any known individual. Nothing ever came of it. The case was considered solved. Closed. But closure is a strange thing in true crime. Courts end cases. But families don't. Communities don't. And the truth, if it ever existed in full, doesn't always make it to the light. Sometimes it dies in a locked bathroom. Sometimes it walks out the front door unnoticed. And sometimes it lives on in the people left behind. Patricia is now in her late 70s. According to the Department of Corrections, she's in fragile but stable condition. She's eligible for parole in 2045. She'll be 98. Brent no longer answers questions about the case. When asked recently by a neighbor if he missed his father, he responded flatly, "I miss the idea of him." And Harold? Well, his story is frozen in time. He will always be 66. Always standing in that shower, unaware of what was waiting outside the glass. Always surrounded by the legacy he built, money, property, weapons, mistrust. And in the end, none of it saved him. Maybe the most haunting part of this case isn't who pulled the trigger. Maybe it's what pushed them to pick it up in the first place. A marriage held together by debt and guilt. A son trying to live in a shadow. A woman trying to turn back time with one final, desperate act of control. And a house full of people pretending to be a family. In the aftermath of the verdict, one juror wrote in her notebook, "We gave her time. But the truth didn't show up." In Lake Haven Estates, where crime was supposed to be impossible and reputations polished like marble, one family imploded behind closed doors. And no sentence, no conviction, no appeal, no years served could undo what happened in that bathroom. Because some homes don't just hide secrets. They breed them. In true crime, there's a moment people wait for. A confession. A piece of evidence so undeniable that it snaps the puzzle into place. Something, anything, that gives us permission to stop wondering. But in the case of Harold Henderson, that moment never came. Instead, what remained was a fractured truth. One where every fact had a shadow, and every answer raised more questions than it solved. Let's return to the blood smear. The one on the gate. Forensic analysts found it days after the murder, overlooked in the rush of responders and investigators. It contained 2 DNA profiles, Harold's and one that didn't match Patricia, Brent, or any law enforcement on scene. It could have come from a medic's glove. A crime scene tech. Even a neighbor who wandered too close before the perimeter was secured. But there's another possibility, one that prosecutors dismissed as implausible, and the defense couldn't prove. That someone else was there. That a third person entered the house that morning, committed the crime, and vanished before anyone arrived. But if that were true, how did they get in? The doors were locked. No windows broken. No alarms triggered until the final shot. The system had logged no motion, no tampering. There was no sign of forced entry. So unless Harold invited someone in, that theory dies in silence. Still it lingers, like a whisper at the edge of a closed room. Then there's the question of intent. The first jury convicted Patricia of first-degree murder. The second dropped it to second degree. Same crime. Different conclusions. But what was Patricia thinking in those final moments? If it was a crime of rage, what exactly pushed her over the edge? The suitcase? The text to Francine? The slow, steady realization that the reconciliation was a lie? Or was it something else? A lifetime of manipulation? A final betrayal? Maybe she didn't plan to shoot him. Maybe she picked up the gun to confront him, to threaten, to scare. Maybe the first shot was a mistake, and the rest, the irreversible aftermath of panic. But 9 shots? That's not panic. That's purpose. And then there's Brent. He passed the gunshot residue test. His DNA wasn't on the weapons. He answered questions freely. He was the one who suggested that Patricia might be mentally unwell. He was the one who described the clicking sound of an empty chamber. But still, something about his story never fully landed. The ammunition in his suitcase. The old grudge against Harold. The quiet composure under pressure. One juror said, "He looked like someone watching a movie he'd already seen." Did Brent know more than he ever admitted? Was he protecting his mother? Or was he protecting himself? And if he was involved, why didn't prosecutors pursue him? Was the case simply cleaner with Patricia as the sole suspect? Was it easier to convict the grieving, aging ex-wife than the son, who could explain his way through every question? That's the cruelty of cases like this. They rarely end with clarity. They end with verdicts, not with truth. And maybe that's why this story refuses to settle. Because beyond the blood, beyond the diary, beyond the forensics and expert testimony, what this case really revealed was how thin the line is between love and destruction. Patricia loved Harold. That's why she loaned him the money. That's why she moved back in. That's why she kept writing in her journal, even as she unraveled. Harold loved Francine, but maybe not in the way she hoped. He kissed her, traveled with her, leaned on her, but never committed. He was a man who kept doors slightly ajar just in case. Brent loved both of them, but in a way that felt like captivity. Trapped between a father who mocked him and a mother who fell apart in front of him. It's hard to say who broke first. But someone did, and Harold paid the price. In the end, what remains isn't certainty. It's ambiguity. And for some, that's more terrifying than any guilty verdict. Because if someone can be murdered inside a locked mansion, surrounded by family, with multiple weapons, under the eye of a modern security system, and we're still not sure who did it, what chance does justice have when the crime scene isn't made of walls, but of secrets? What happens when guilt wears a calm face, and innocence doesn't say a word? We expect stories to resolve, for truth to win, for the bad guy to lose. But real life doesn't follow scripts, and real crime doesn't offer closure. It only offers aftermath. The case of Harold Henderson ended with a sentence, but it never really ended. Not for the people who knew him, not for the son who walked away, and not for a justice system still haunted by what it couldn't fully explain. But as the years passed and the headlines faded, one question refused to go away. Could it happen again? Not this exact crime, not this specific family, not this house, not this trigger, but this pattern, this slow erosion of love, this quiet war behind closed doors, this deadly silence disguised as reconciliation. The truth is, it already has, and it likely will again. Because for all our cameras, our laws, our courtrooms, and our security systems, none of them can see what festers behind a smile. Harold and Patricia were never supposed to be tragic. They were the blueprint of American success. Wealthy, well-dressed, respected. They lived in a home most people could only dream of. And yet, their story ended with a 9mm in a bathroom and a body on cold tile. How? It didn't happen in a moment. It happened over time. 1,000 tiny cuts of disappointment. 1,000 swallowed arguments. The lies they told each other. The truths they never told themselves. Patricia, trying to reclaim a life that no longer wanted her. Harold, trying to escape a marriage he no longer believed in. Brent, stuck between their wreckage, rewriting his own story just to survive it. Could it happen again? Ask the woman whose husband still calls his ex every other night. Ask the man whose name is on the house, but not on her heart. Ask the adult child watching his parents destroy each other with every word unspoken. This case wasn't about madness. It wasn't about sudden rage. It was about accumulated weight, emotional, financial, psychological. And what happens when the people carrying it run out of strength? You want a warning sign? Here it is. When people stop speaking honestly, when love becomes a debt to repay instead of a gift to share, when silence becomes louder than the arguments used to be, that's when it begins. It begins in bedrooms, in passive-aggressive dinners, in unsent messages, in quiet resentment that finally finds a voice in a locked drawer, a loaded gun, a goodbye note never written. We tell ourselves we'd see it coming. We'd hear the tension. We'd spot the danger. But the most dangerous families don't scream. They whisper. And eventually, they stop whispering at all. True crime isn't always about monsters. Sometimes, it's about ordinary people who break in ways that leave no visible scars, until someone ends up dead. The Hendersons were not monsters. They were fractured. And in that fracture, something terrible slipped through. Harold's death was not a fluke. It was a symptom of everything that went untreated, of everything that went unspoken. And it serves as a mirror, not just for one family, but for any family who thinks love without truth is enough. Because it isn't. Not in marriages, not in parenthood, not in the quiet halls of gated communities where the grass is cut perfectly, but no one says hello anymore. Harold died in a locked bathroom, but the real tragedy is that he'd been dying slowly in that house for years. So could it happen again? Yes, it does. Every time people choose silence over honesty, pride over vulnerability, control over compassion. Every time someone says it's fine, when it isn't. Every time a relationship becomes a power struggle instead of a partnership. Every time we ignore the cracks, hoping the foundation will hold. It won't. That's the story beneath this story. That's what made this case more than a headline. It's a warning, not just about what someone did, but about what any of us could become. If we lose sight of who we once were, if we forget that even in silence, something can still explode. And that is the story of Harold Henderson, a man whose wealth couldn't protect him, a family whose silence turned deadly, and a truth still blurred by doubt. Was justice truly served? Or was this just the version we could live with? In the end, it's not always about who fired the gun, but what pushed them to pick it up in the first place. If this story moved you, made you think twice, or left you unsettled, you're not alone. Because these aren't just cases. They're cautionary tales. And sometimes they're reflections. Tell us in the comments. Do you believe Patricia acted alone? Or was there more behind that locked door? If you want more stories like this, real, raw, and unforgettable, hit like, tap subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for watching.